In this particular webinar, to start it off, the problem we're going to look at is the problem of radicalisation or extremism, but in a particular sense, and that is that we're seeing an increasing incidence of extremist groups feeding off each other, often at the opposite end of the spectrum. So we call it tit-for-tat extremism, or academics who like to create different words call it, and now Matthew's laughing, I can see him, cumulative radicalisation. Great words, those. Anyhow, we're going to look at that problem and see, what it is, how widespread it is, maybe how it compares with other countries, and, what possible solutions there are to it. So I'm going to hand over to Matthew now, and he's going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes. Then, we're going to take questions from you and comments. So please, you can see on the right-hand side of the screen where you can put questions and comments up. So, please do that. Feel free to do that while Matthew's talking, but especially when he's finished, and then we'll put those questions to Matthew. So Matthew, thanks for doing this, and we got you on in the nick of time. So over to you, and please let us know about, what you have learned from your academic experience and your personal experience of this problem of cumulative radicalisation.
Thanks, Francis, and thanks to you and to GlobalNet for hosting me to talk about this issue, which is really one that's become quite central to a lot of policymaking discussions in the UK. As you can see there from the first of 7 slides that I'm hoping to show as I really quickly skip through this, I do think that, as Francis has said, it's really important that we have a discussion and we have some back and forth. So I'll answer as many questions as I can over the next 50 minutes or so. But my own perspective, as you can see there, is driven by my work for the Center for Fascist, Anti-Fascist, and Post-Fascist Studies. So we're really looking at forms of radical right or far right extremism and the way in which they can interact with diametrically opposed views, in some cases jihadi Islamism, in other cases anti-fascist activism or anti-far right activism. So we're going to look a little bit more closely at that, and we'll start off with this very difficult term. If I could have the next slide, Francis. You can see there, it is a mouthful, as Francis has said. Sorry, just one back there. What is cumulative extremism? There we are, sorry. And the term itself was really only coined 11 years ago by the political scientist Roger Eatwell. You can see there in a small academic text that he talks about one form of extremism that can feed off and magnify other forms. And what he had in mind, actually, at that time was some of the violence around the Bradford and Oldham riots, which saw a kind of Trojan horse entry by National Front groups that were really trying to antagonize some of the Muslim youth in the regions, and really created a hot spot right throughout some of those regions for a short time, 15 or so years ago. Broadly speaking, this idea of cumulative extremism, tit-for-tat extremism, reciprocal radicalization, it goes by, I'm afraid, a number of different academic terms, despite only being about 10 years old, is really at basis looking at two diametrically opposed, and I think this is the important point, extremist organizations. This isn't Democrats and Republicans or Tories and Labor. These are two organizations or groups at the extreme, and the way in which they not only interact with one another, but they, in a sense, rely on each other's narrative to bolster their own. And indeed, it can lead to types of antagonistic behavior and an escalation of hatred and even violence that I think a number of academics are continuing to comment upon, and is really something that seems to be moving up the agenda politically as well. Writing in 2006, as I mentioned, Roger Eatwell was primarily concerned with the National Front, but also the British National Party, particularly attempting to stir up trouble and disharmony and harm community cohesion in places with large Muslim minorities, and to kind of build on what they expected to be the intemperate response from those communities. As I mentioned before, Roger Eatwell was particularly influenced by the Bradford riots. That was a kind of a specific incident that he looked at, which drove tension between the city's Asian population, many of whom were alleged to have been developing a more radical Asian identity, and the far right, broadly speaking. Alongside this, the British National Party, which already in 2001 had been expressing their anti-Muslim hatred for a number of years, and their aggressive response in particular as you can see there on the bottom right, to the London 7/7 bombings by British Islamist extremists, demonstrated how intrinsically linked the nature of these two different forms of extremism and potential for a spiral of violence can be. And I think it's important to remember at the time of, and we'll go to the next slide, Francis, if we could, at the time of the 7/7 attacks, briefly afterwards, no less than Nick Griffin himself in 2005 wrote, really, with the media playing Islamophobic messages like a scratch CD, the proper choice of enemy shouldn't be left to rocket science. What he was referring to there is, let's get away from talking about Holocaust denial, biological racism, and many of those things that have marked the extreme right, and get into what he felt was a much more populist form of exclusion and xenophobia, that targeting the Muslim community and really tarring them all with the same brush. And I think this is an important point just at the start to point out, that we might be talking about a small group of, let's take an example, the English Defence League, which I'll come on to in a moment. We might be talking about a small group of people, but to radical jihadi Islamists, they might turn around and say, this small group of people is actually representative of white Britain or the white working class as a whole, when they drunkenly get out on the streets and shout invective at our community. This isn't really just a small group of bigoted people, but this is an indication of what Britain is really like. Okay, so that's one form of the extreme response, prejudiced response that can drive cumulative extremism. On the other hand, you might find that precisely those same EDL supporters, again, I'm just using that as an example, say it's not, for example, the terrorist outrages of 7/7 that are committed by jihadi Islamist terrorists who are also Muslim or claim to be Muslim, but it is actually the way in which the whole of the Muslim community in Britain actually feels. So in that sense, one points to the other opposite extreme and says, yes, but that is a Trojan horse for really how they all feel. And with that kind of rhetoric allows for prejudice against entire communities. And so in that way, we can say that groups at the extreme, as it were, representing a tiny proportion of the electorate in Britain, can actually raise the temperature for whole communities. And I want to give a couple of examples of that, I think, not just in trying to get at some of the growing salience of this tit-for-tat extremism, in trying to explain certain aspects of intra-community tensions and the way in which these different extreme groups have interacted with each other. And Francis, if we can just go to the next slide, please. As we can see there, some people think that this kinds of cumulative extremism can be more threatening to the liberal democratic order than even attacks on their own by lone wolf extreme right-wingers, or even al-Qaeda-inspired so-called spectacular bombings, again, thinking of 7/7 there in particular. Now, again, I'm going to use the term there, cumulative extremism, but again, tit-for-tat radicalization, reciprocal extremism are all kinds of synonyms. I want to just give a couple of examples here because it's quite a heavy theoretical trope that people are using, and I think putting some flesh on it with some specific examples is really important. So if we can go to the next slide here, I'd like to start with the founding of the English Defence League. And I think that's probably the best example that we have. As you can see there, Sanawal Jama was picketing the Royal Anglian Homecoming Parade, as many of you will know, in 2009. And these were returning Anglican soldiers coming back from Afghanistan, and they were really abused by a radical group that had been linked to Anjem Chowdhury. Within months, there was a direct response from the so-called United People of Luton in 2009, and that very quickly became helmed by Stephen Yaxley Lennon, also known as Tommy Robinson, who said this isn't just a small group of extremist views, but this really represents all of what we're seeing in Luton. It is that broad brush approach that, again, can embolden extremists on both sides. So the response from these early counter-jihad organizations that was sparked by this March 2009 protest ultimately gave us the English Defence League. I think that one particularly, and again, the idea behind the English Defence League at first was to reclaim the streets of Luton from Muslim fanatics. The English Defence League was very specifically formed in response to a local event in Luton. Now, as we know, the English Defence League, during its sort of heyday between 2010 and 2013 or so, was really able to have marches and demonstrations right across the country, sometimes garnering thousands of people and many more counter-protesters. Another example of these cumulative extremes can be some of the way that violence erupted at those protests and demonstration, and the way in which activists from both sides, so-called anti-fascists and English Defence League supporters, both arrested in large numbers at some of these demonstrations. I'd like to kind of go on then to before just again putting on the EDL's putting to you that the EDL's origins therefore lie in a very specific set of instances that are local responses. I'd like to now move on a little bit further to another example, if I could, Francis. I think we're on slide 5 now. And this is the one that we really have slightly better evidence for, metrical evidence of hate crimes. The appalling terroristic murder of drummer Lee Rigby on the 22nd of May, 2013. He was a serving soldier with the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. There you see at the top the two terroristic murderers who tried to behead him on a London street and literally held bloody hands, in a sense, proudly proclaiming their act of pretty horrific violence. And I think this is the really important point here. The two killers were apparently motivated by the fact that Lee Rigby was a soldier who had served in the Middle East. They were literally driving around looking for someone that they could attack, that they associated with what they viewed as British misguided foreign policy in the Middle East and elsewhere. Now, as I mentioned, the very bloody nature of the attack on Lee Rigby was always likely to inflame the public. The very fact that it was filmed, often on camera phones with people really just there at the time of the attack. It's also bears noting that Lee Rigby was a young father and, of course, a well-loved soldier who was simply innocently going about his daily life. The country witnessed this, the grim aftermath of his murder on TV, and one of the unrepentant attackers literally clenching a blood-stained machete, boasting of the crime to those people who were watching and at that time filming. Yet here's the point, I think. It was far-right groups that provided the most violent and most immediate response. They were typically not distinguishing, again, I think this is at the kernel of cumulative extremism, between the vast majority of law-abiding citizens who are Muslims in this country and the very small proportion of extremist jihadi terrorists, and conflating those two and say, for example, it is all the Muslims, making no differentiation between Shia and Shiite Muslims, let's say, no distinction between young and old, male and female. It is all simply the Muslims, of who, of course, 3 million Muslim citizens reside in this country. And so when we look at the murder of Lee Rigby, and especially its aftermath, one of the things that we find that's really jarring, I think, is the rise in hate attacks. And if we could have the next slide, Francis, I think it's our penultimate one. One of the things that we saw was no less than a 373% increase in attacks in the weeks following Lee Rigby than those compared with the year afterwards. In a sense, it is almost as if this appalling murder gave a kind of license to people on the far right to attack people on the basis of their ethnicity or their faith. And I think that the other image that you see up there on the left is the number of mosque attacks that occurred. The dividing line there is the murder of Lee Rigby, and as you can see, there were certainly several mosque attacks in the country that happened in the previous months. Yet in the 6 months after the attack on Lee Rigby, that number rose dramatically to fully 34 attacks on mosques, sometimes posting things like bacon through the letterbox, sometimes full-blown arson attacks on mosques. So that gave us really for the first time, some detailed evidence on the nature of cumulative extremism and the way in which one type of extreme can lead to another type of extreme. The final example that I'd like to show you there is the way in which we're now starting to move away from some of these traditional views of cumulative extremism. The first, in its classic form, is again these two contesting groups that have mutually antagonistic and indeed irreconcilable views. They're diametrically opposed. But the idea that there's only sort of two players, as it were, in the cumulative extremism game has been shown by some recent evidence to be at least overstated. And there you can see Sydney, Paris, and Copenhagen. These are attacks or attempted terroristic acts in 2015. Many will remember the 60-hour attacks in Paris. As you can see there, the 7-day attacks online and offline are really quite elevated. We also see in Copenhagen, where there was another attack in February 2015 by jihadi Islamist terrorists that saw another spike in hate crimes. Sydney, as some of you may remember, in December 2015, was when a man associated or claiming association with so-called IS or Daesh stormed into a Sydney shopping center, took hostages, and was a many-hour standoff before it was diffused. I think the important thing, the difference that we see in Sydney, Paris, and Copenhagen is, of course, the latter two are closer to Britain. They are only an hour ahead of time, and the Sydney story broke in the UK at 4 o'clock in the morning. So I think that there's importance there about time and about location that can elevate some of these levels of responses. But perhaps most importantly about the Sydney findings was that the reportage very early on declared the alleged attacker, Manharis Monis, as someone who had a criminal past, may have been mentally troubled, and was not someone that could simply just be thrown into the same basket as jihadi Islamist terrorists. He had a very checkered past, which meant that there was a more nuanced response in the media reporting. And I think that that raises a really important question. One of the final two that I'd like to end on, that question being, are there only two influencers to cumulative extremism? Or does the media play perhaps an even decisive role in how they frame and report, in this case, terrorist attacks? And I think that's something that we really should hold on to. My final thought, and it doesn't really need a slide because it's something that many people in Britain will know, there was a real troubling spike in hate crimes after Brexit, and to a lesser extent, although the evidence is still not fully in, after the election of Donald Trump in America. Neither of these things were in and of themselves extreme. They obviously weren't terrorist or violent extremist acts. And I think that it raises the question of whether or not we can put cumulative extremism into an even bigger and more generic box. Yes, cumulative extremism is about extremes on different sides of the political spectrum contesting each other and driving up the temperature in various communities. But can we also talk about more general trigger events that might not need to be an act of terrorism that leads to them, but could be something like Brexit, which seemed to have led to a spike in what might be called celebratory racism, by some people believing that the Brexit vote had given license to acts of extremism against others. And I think that idea of a trigger event, which in the case of Brexit saw fully 41% of increased hate crime attacks, really can give us a wider picture of the way in which some of these cumulative extremisms or tit-for-tat actions can come about, not necessarily just through an act of terrorism, as in cumulative extremism, but more generic trigger events that may very well come about through things like the election of Donald Trump or Brexit. I think I'll leave it there, Francis.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're getting some feedback. It might be, oh no, it's gone. Okay, that's great. So I hope that we don't get any more feedback. That was great presentation. So thank you, Matthew. I see you've got a bit of a cough, and I turned my microphone off because I was developing a cumulative cough, and so you know, I hope you're not too feeling too bad. Anyhow, please. The rest of you, you know, as you listen to this, put some comments on or some questions on, and Matthew will pick those up and discuss some of those issues with you, because I think the description he gave about how one feeds off of the other, and not just, you know, not just actions or demonstrations at each end, but events like Trump and Brexit as well, are quite interesting. Nicole says, Matthew, that yeah, they do feed off each other, but of course they can happen in isolation as well, and that's true, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, I think cumulative extremism is about these linked form of extremisms. By no means is someone suggesting that, let's say, historically groups on the extreme right weren't self-starters and ideologically, in a sense, fully formed with a whole slew of targets that they wanted to attack or that they thought were somehow lesser valuable citizens, and of course things that they also wanted to see happen. So there's no doubt that there are extremist groups that are, in a sense, quite happy to carry on tilling their own field without necessarily needing to respond to these types of outrages and provocations. But I think it's what we see in things like cumulative extremism, sometimes very boldly. I'll give one example that didn't really make it into my talk there, is that a number of jihadi Islamist terrorists tried to attend a EDL rally in Dewsbury in 2011 with the purposes of attacking it. Those people all received really severe jail sentences because they had terrorist materials and guns. Their attempt, again, not just to target Britain as a whole, but to target the English Defence League, which they saw as, in a sense, the great enemy facing, in this case, Salafi ideology.
Abdul says, I mean, he's taking up this idea of tit-for-tat extremism, cumulative radicalisation, and he's saying that in a way, the tit-for-tat process, if you like, gives a reason for those sides to exist. I mean, the opposite gives them the reason. They need each other to have a purpose.
And I agree with Abdul in some of the more recent groups, or what maybe is a better way of thinking about it is in a single issue groups. And I absolutely agree with Abdul that groups like the EDL or maybe Britain First are primarily anti-Muslim organizations. That is to say, that's kind of what they're about. They claim to be against jihadi Islamism, but the way it teases out and what puts them on the far right is that they're quite happy to ally radical terrorist people who claim to be Muslim and the wider Muslim community in Britain. I do think that those groups we can talk about as having been created to foster that conflict. I would be more careful about comparisons with something like the BNP, which has a whole slew, as I mentioned, a whole ideology, part of which is anti-Muslim, but part of which is also anti-Jewish, part of which is anti-parliamentary democracy and so forth. They weren't created, as it were, for this single purpose of antagonizing other communities. The other group that you've mentioned, Unite Against Fascism, obviously in their title, the anti-fascism is very clear that in a sense they exist to combat what they see as fascism. So I think in some cases, yes, it is. They need the other to have a purpose to exist, but that doesn't go for all groups on the extremes.
That's quite an interesting distinction. Do you want to say more about that? Because it didn't occur to me. On one hand, you've got groups like the BNP, which has a wide program of extremism, and then you've got other groups that exist really to attack a specific community. Do you classify them in those two areas?
Well, and I think that probably when we're looking at these single issue groups, they tend to be more like social movements. And the most visible of these anti-Muslim social movements is the so-called online counter-jihad movement. It really does exist to, as they claim, raise concerns or highlight abuses through jihadi Islamist terrorism and other forms of extremism. But again, as we so often see, it's really kind of a Trojan horse for Muslims don't belong here and aren't really able to fit in culturally or even ethnically oftentimes into Europe. But I do think that if we're talking about groups like the National Front or the BNP, which are political parties that are contesting power and therefore have full manifestos that are many, many pages long that have a raft of different proposals. For example, the BNP is very outspoken about reintroducing the death penalty for certain crimes. Now, that really has nothing to do in and of itself. It's been a policy they've had for a long time in and of itself in a response to terrorism. Now, certainly they can try to make hay, as it were, to some of these issues and try to normalize or mainstream their message to try to get it into a much more wider public forum. But I think that's fundamentally different from groups like Britain First, which are pretty much, dare I say it, first and foremost anti-Muslim groups.
Obviously, that groups that are extremists need air to breathe, and often that air is the air of publicity. And Nicole raises that the press has a role here, and extremist groups understand that, don't they? So they understand that the press is looking for, extreme actions. They're looking for lines that make ratings and so on. I mean, what responsibility has the press got in the development of cumulative extremism? And, you know, what can we do to tackle that?
Thanks. And those are really the hardest questions. This is still a new area of research, and I'm really glad that Nicole brought up that question, because you're right. The media may even be decisive in the way in which cumulative extremism, as we saw in that last slide there with Sydney, the way that they provided nuanced reporting, giving a possibility for multiple motives for the Sydney attack. Again, criminal history, history of mental illness, none of those things should be used to stigmatize criminals or people with mental health challenges. That goes without saying. But the fact that it provided a nuanced frame rather than extremist Muslims did it seems to me to have a value in terms of encouraging the rest of the media perhaps not to go with unsubstantiated rumor. I'm talking generally, not in terms of Sydney or any other specific attack, to verify information where they can, and to, of course, make the distinction between jihadi Islamist extremists, which do exist. These people do exist, and they're a very, very small number, and to differentiate them between the lawful, peaceful and good citizens that we know our Muslim neighbors to be. And I think breaking that link is as much a responsibility of the media as it is incumbent upon all people of goodwill to stand up against racism and prejudice. This is simply just another form of racist. By saying all Muslims are terrorists is not very different from saying all Jews are usurious or conspiring. These are the same kinds of things that were used to tar entire communities.
Abdul has this nice quote that he's found somewhere, that a lie can travel halfway around the world where the truth is still getting its pants on. I'm trying to envisage that, but it's quite a good saying. Because,
well, and I'd even go even further. He's absolutely right as regards the media, but I think he's especially right as regards social media. And some of these groups, I'll give you one example. We mentioned Britain First before, are extremely good at social media. So they might put on Facebook, click like if you like puppies, or if you support beaches, or some other, you know, very anodyne statement. And through that strategy have gotten more than 1 million Facebook likes. Now, what they're certainly not doing is getting 1 million people on the street. But through that savvy use of media, they're then able to drive some of their other messages to some of those people that have liked their pages, which might turn around and say, come and support our next so-called mosque invasion or Christian patrols. And those are the kinds of things that really do fuel this so-called tit-for-tat extremism.
I mean, that's true of social media particularly, isn't it? I mean, not just mainstream media. There's a problem there, and that's one problem to deal with in one way. But, you know, it's been argued that Google, for example, has developed its API so that when it does searches, it finds extreme groups in some form or the other. I mean, it may not be done intentionally, but that's how the program works. And is that a problem you come across or done any research on?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we talked about it in Parliament only this week, that France has decided to really kind of change the algorithms so that some of those groups don't come up as high in the Google ratings. So to some degree, ISPs, web host companies and so forth might have more of a degree of control than we thought. That being said, after an appalling outrage, I'm sure all of us can agree, 7/7 or the Breivik attack, of course, in Norway in 2011, after these kinds of appalling attacks, of course the media is going to put it on the front page and is going to run with it, not least because of a responsibility to their readers and viewers. These really are important breaking stories. But I do think that even though we know they're going to report on them, they're probably going to report on them in that kind of 24-hour news cycle way that we've become familiar with. But that's not the same as reporting irresponsibly, reporting rumor, and perhaps most damagingly, reporting in a way that gives rise to prejudiced views. And I think that's the one thing that we really have to, through things like independent complaints commissions and so forth, have the power to change. And I think that's where organized political action can make a difference.
Nicole asks again, you know, the question I think lots of us ask ourselves, and that is, how does a group like the BNP appear respectable? How does it get into the public domain holding radical views and sort of convince people, fool people if you like them, maybe that's not a good word, that they're a genuine radical party, not an extreme party? Is that a problem in the case of extremism, that people sort of wear sheep's clothing, but underneath the wolf is still there?
Yeah, and in fact, I'll just tell a very brief story about the BNP in 1999. This is when Nick Griffin took over with plans to kind of moderate the party's message. Now, the reason for that was twofold. One, the then leader of the party, John Tyndall, only months before had been caught running around in Nazi uniform giving swastika. Okay, so again, the idea that you're not an extreme party when your leader's in, kind of Nazi clothing really undermines that point. Also in 1999, you'll remember that the terrorist bomber David Copeland attacked places that had been populated in London by gay, Asian, and Black Britons. Again, choosing those targets deliberately, vulnerable communities. He had been associated with the BNP, and again, whether or not even most members may have rejected that political act of terrorism, clearly that tars your group. So Nick Griffin tried very hard from 1999 until he lost his seat and the sort of wheels came off the BNP in the recent years here, tried to moderate that tone. And so what you saw was not him talking about, for example, Jews and denying the Holocaust in the way in which previous generations of extreme right activists may have done. He started encoding his language, and that kind of linguistic encoding is very important. So he started talking about vested interests or international elites. So another word that we're hearing now, which for most people doesn't ring alarm bells, globalists. Well, if we go back 50 or 75 years, globalist was code for Jews. Globalist now doesn't necessarily have that resonance for the mass majority of people because that word has been normalized. I'd like to think that most people using that word, if they knew it was a historically anti-Semitic term, would hesitate before using it. So some of that use of language to normalize otherwise radical and, in my opinion, racist ideas, I think are very, very concerning. It's been a long-term project, and the BNP, I think, is probably as good an example of any, is an attempt to moderate language to not appear as extreme as you actually are. I would suggest that's a real Trojan horse approach that Nick Griffin tried to pioneer in 1999 in the UK.
Okay, so I mean, you've explained the problem really well, and it is a huge sort of problem, and you've described it. But finding solutions to it is very difficult, and that's something we're going to look at, we hope, in other webinars. But maybe you could say one or two things about it. We talk about the extremists, and we have visions of them of being sort of demons with horns coming out of their head. But how important is it when you're trying to deal with the problem to, first of all, humanize those people, to realize that people in those groups are human beings, and they're in it very often because they come from really dysfunctional backgrounds, and you've got to approach them in a way that's positive rather than adversarial all the time.
Yeah, and I think from what I can see just on the webinar chat here, we have some very smart people, so I'd love to throw the door open for other solutions. I just have two brief observations. One, entirely as you say, though I might vehemently disagree with people who are racist or extreme in their views, I don't think taking what I call the Dr. Evil approach is all that helpful, which is thinking of them as that character in Austin Powers who wake up and say, I'm so evil, I just want to do more evil, I love evil. That's not how people think. They might see their way misguided fundamentally, as I believe it is, as trying to achieve some sort of good. So I think trying to start from the human is probably useful. The second thing that I would suggest is breaking some of those narratives. And the best example I can use that I thought was really inspiring in the city of York, only a couple of years ago, the English Defence League came to town. And rather than having a loud and vociferous, and they can sometimes get violent, counter-protest, the mosque in York organized cups of tea for those protesters and a match of football afterwards. And that really broke down, I think, some of the stereotypes that EDL members had about, in particular, the younger members of the Muslim community, who they found themselves kicking a football around with and sharing cups of tea, which both groups seemed to like quite happily, and really led to, I think, a very peaceful day in York that could have otherwise turned out badly. So I do think that, as you say, Francis, kind of humanizing the problem, dealing with other human beings is helpful. Not always going to be the case that we can give them cups of tea and play football, but I think that some of these initiatives come from the ground up, and they don't need nerds like me to necessarily say it, where people all across the country, I think, are coming up with really good ideas to move across some of these divides and try to share what it is that brings us together and what we have in common, which is almost invariably far stronger and far longer than what it is that divides us.
I mean, that's interesting because one of the posts I put up a little while ago with a very interesting video was a black musician in America who is spending his life traveling around the country talking to members of the Ku Klux Klan. And as a result of that, he's got 200 people to leave the Ku Klux Klan. They suddenly become friends. They see they have a lot in common. And they see that sometimes that what separates them is mythology and not reality. Are those things important to do and to help people to do that?
I struggle with putting identity first usually, Francis, but I think it is important if it's the story that I'm thinking about. This was an African-American man. And again, usually it doesn't matter. An argument is an argument, a position is a position. But the fact that this African-American man was reaching across, again, this massive divide and saying, I want to listen. And I also want to show you that some of your stereotypes and prejudices are very ill-founded, and let me serve myself up as a personal example. I thought that was, again, very courageous. And as you say, he's brought someone to, I've seen the number quoted, 200 people through a kind of process that we call de-radicalization. And some of these de-radicalization projects do work. We have some evidence in Germany of the way in which the extreme right can be de-radicalized when it comes out of what can oftentimes, and here's another aspect of the problem that we didn't really bring up, that can resemble more like cults or small sects than actual political movements. These are like-minded people who really have kind of reinforcement of their beliefs in a very, very small echo chamber. So disrupting that, bringing in other information, ideally factual, persuasive information, I think is a good way forward.
Yeah, I actually got that story from a site called Positive News, which is a website that looks at what positive things are going on in the world.
Sadly, that's an oxymoron these days. Positive news doesn't have much purchase these days.
That's why they do it, because they think most of the conventional media think that ratings are about giving bad news. So
the American phrase is, if it leads, it leads, I'm afraid. So yes, positive news is a welcome anecdote in that respect.
Yeah, but Abdul raises an interesting point that extremism is not just about people, it's about narratives. And the narrative can often almost exist independent of people, so that he's interested in getting into a conversation about narratives, about extremism. What is extremism? What isn't extremism? Because you can be not extremist, but occasionally you can use extremist narratives. Now, that takes you into a really complex area. I mean, do you have any comments on that?
Well, first of all, I think we could look at a group like Breitbart News or some of the windier sections of the tabloid press here and say that some of them are using some of these memes, even if they're not necessarily thoroughly extremist themselves. I also agree with Abdul that the taxonomic use of radical, extreme, far, for example, the right, is heavily contested area. Scholars work for decades trying to tease out differences between them. One thing I think is that we could all agree on, extremism is a moving target. And a lot of times what has historically been seen as extreme changes over time. I'll just give you one minor example that I think all of us would champion and put on a 10-pound note now, which is female suffragettes, some of whom were using violent and direct action means to gain the vote for women. They were absolutely dismissed as extremists a century ago, before women got the vote, of course, after the First World War in this country, and were roundly criticized in the press. Now, again, that I guess would be considered a progressive form of extremism to try to extend the Enlightenment project to all subjects in this country. But I think it's important to say we wouldn't now regard that suffragette movement as an extremist movement unless we saw it in the context of the time, that frankly mainstream opinion would have seen them as a minority position, one that wasn't really willing to just submit itself to common discussion, but use direct action politics. And I think that if we take that example, most people would say that was, or desegregation in America. Those people were a minority, even if what they've done now has become accepted and part of the mainstream. And I think that constantly shifting boundary about what we understand as extreme is precisely, dare I say, the bread and butter of what academics, and particularly political science, tries to do, and show that even groups, for example, like the Front National in France, is less extreme now under Marine Le Pen than it was under her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who founded and ran the movement for decades.
And say have fallen out, which is quite interesting. But I mean, Peter says that extremist narrative very often is used by populists, which very often have very wide appeal, and it makes it very difficult to address that, because they will, you know, call you an elite, a metropolitan elite. You don't understand ordinary people and how they think, and you're too politically correct and so on. And populists aren't necessarily extremists, but they can use extreme narratives. Now, how do you address that problem if you're in a community?
Well, what's interesting, populism was coined in Russia in the mid-19th century. It's been around a long, long time. What's interesting is not just that populism exists and can exist on the left, it can exist on the right, it can even be an apolitical form of populism. So populism isn't necessarily attached to just one ideology. As Francis rightly said, it's a kind of a them versus us, the people versus everyone else. And that's not in any way inherently extreme, especially when you get oligarchic or corrupt regimes that really are out of touch with the people. Populism, for example, like in the Arab Spring, can be something that really galvanizes people in I think most people would say positive ways in terms of liberal democracy. So I think keeping that in mind is really important. Yet at the same time, we do need to ask why it is that there seems to have been a rise in parties that are very deliberately populist, or in the case of someone like Donald Trump, very, very clearly playing populist messages saying, I'm with the people, the elites in Washington are out of touch. And what makes that message in, let's say, 2016 resonate so much stronger than, let's say, the presidential election in 2012, when both Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, pretty securely members of the elite. I think most people would agree that Donald Trump also, if you're a billionaire, you're not one of the common people. None of them were necessarily populist themselves, but Donald Trump was able to carry through a very populist message in 2016. I think Brexit was a very populist message in 2016. What makes them really powerful now seems to me an extremely important question. We might talk about social media, we might talk about attitudinal or even demographic changes, but I'm not sure if any of those explains why it is that, let's say, 2016 was really a year of populism, but 2015 might not have been in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, we actually have a House of Commons meeting coming up on January the 25th on the rise of populism, and one academic there from Bristol who I hope will give a definition of what he thinks it is, because very often we don't have a proper definition of it, and that's quite important. Susan raises the interesting point too about extremism and cults using people to groom young people, particularly. Now they groom they groom young people in schools, and I know from the work we've done on gang culture, for example, they groom people in gangs. Now, how do we actually get to people to get them to recognize what grooming is, and that the characteristics of grooming and how they may be victims of that? How do we adjust that problem as well, or address that problem?
I guess my first response would be to agree with Susan. Having met with Alex Stein just this week and talked to her about some of her work on cults, she just did a splendid book on cults and cult behavior. And there's now several really important studies by Steve Hassan and also by Masood Sadr that deal with the mindsets that are inculcated in cults. The idea of it being a closed information model. Think of a closed circuit. The cult only works if the circuit is closed. Once it's open, other information gets in. That's when people can start questioning the legitimacy and veracity of the information they're given by cults. Now, clearly, cults have traditionally been extreme or even heretical religious organizations. So when we talk about cults in a secular way or associate them with forms of political violence, perhaps people have seen, for example, the so-called IS has been called a death cult. Again, that's really kind of on the border between faith and politics. So I think that applying cults beyond the spectrum they were originally intended is something we need to do with care. But I think that we can learn in political science a great deal from people who have studied cults and the mindset that is inculcated there, Francis, as you say, grooming at a young age, shutting down other informational alternatives, oftentimes, though not always, really trying to cut people off from their family and sources of contact. Those are things that really extreme groups, I can only speak for the extreme right political groups, have engaged in, and I think that that's really important. So I would commend Alex Stein's work, and I think that the idea about cults and some of the understandings we have can be applied across the spectrum, but we have to know that we're applying it. We're applying it from a different set of ideas, but I do think it's very useful, and I'd really recommend that. I think that scholars need to look more closely at those connections.
One thing that populists and the sort of extremists that you're talking about and in your presentation have in common, I don't mean they're the same as each other, but one thing they have in common is they both believe they speak on behalf of the people.
Yeah.
So, you know, in the Brexit debate, 52% voted to leave. And that is the people, as far as they're concerned, particularly the hard Brexiteers, that is the people. We speak on behalf of the people. The other 48% don't matter. Populists did that in South America, but they were left wing rather than right wing and so on. And you said that about extremists. They want you to believe that, you know, extreme Muslims really represent the whole of Muslims, and extreme Muslims or radicalized Muslims want you to think the far right represents all white people.
Yes.
So, you know, there's this idea that we represent the people and anyone who opposes us is enemies of the people. So how do we confront that? How do we get it over that these aren't really the people, that we live in a plural, diverse society and you can't homogenize in that way?
I think they are the people, or they are some of the people. They're clearly not all of the people, because in democracies, people have sharply differing views, and sometimes those views simply are not commensurate, like Brexit or leave versus remain. You can't really fudge that one. Either you're for one or the other, or you don't care. The idea is you can't have a little bit of both. And so I think it's important to point out some political realities that exist, but also I think, you know, again, as we had said before, dialogue between these incommensurate groups can, at the very least, especially if it's evidence-led metrical dialogue, can actually still, for people that are willing to change their minds, can still allow people to change their minds one way or another. And I think, yes, as Susan has just posted there, education is a long-term goal. And I would add specifically digital literacy, recognizing post-truth and fake news are important things to break some of these prejudicial, stereotyped views. But I think we also have to take seriously some of those views as well. That I take seriously extreme right views doesn't mean that I agree with them, and it certainly doesn't mean that I endorse them or want them to persist and grow in strength, but simply just dismissing them as fringe crackpots, I don't think helps anyone.
I know you have to go at 5:02, so and we've had some really interesting questions up, but you know, in the final few moments while you're here, I mean, are you optimistic about the future? Do you think we're going into a cycle that's very dangerous? And you know, is this unique to our time, or have you seen this before? And is it like the Buddhist, you know, up and down cycle, or are we really going into rough times?
Well, as a devoted reader of Samuel Beckett, I'm not sure I'm optimistic about anything, but that might be a point for another conversation. What I would say is that, yes, there have been really troubling moments over the last year, and some of those are really shaking the foundations of democracy. I do not think the barbarians of whatever ideological sort are at the gate, and I think that cooler heads still must and can prevail. I don't think that we're back into the 1930s redux, not least because we don't have the kind of existential crisis that, let's say, Germany may have faced or Italy may have faced between the wars. So we are not there. And even if I've never believed that history simply repeats itself, yes, it can echo. So learning lessons from the past is important. But I hesitate when I say, are we at some of those really breaking, I wouldn't say breaking point because that's a racist poster that UKIP used as part of this cumulative radicalization, arguably. But are we at a point of fundamental political uncertainty and change? No, I don't think that we are. In fact, in Parliament, I was asked only 2 days ago whether or not there'd still be British democracy in 20 years. Well, extremists can't do that to us. We can only do it to ourselves, as in stepping away from democracy or fundamentally assaulting the political culture of this country. So in that sense, I think courage, cooler heads prevailing, and a longer sense of Britain's history can actually help us here.
So do you think one of the things that we need to do is to be a lot more confident and a lot more assertive about a pluralist democracy?
Yes, I do. And I think that we need to talk about what unifies us, but at the same time, being aware of those extremist arguments and breaking the link between, let's say, this is the English Defence League and is a group of 500, oftentimes white working class men, breaking that link between that is these 500 people, rather than the fact that they are speaking for tens of millions of white working class men in this country, and vice versa. That is what cumulative extremism feeds upon, is these, the academic word would be metonymies. You take one small group and you say they actually stand for the whole. Breaking that link, I think, breaks the power of cumulative extremism.
So the sort of that the process or the activity of dialogue is important amongst those people who aren't, well, it's important for those who are on extremes, as we showed with the black musician in America, but for mainstream people who aren't on those areas, it's important to talk together, is it? I mean, I think some research showed some time ago that lots of people don't have a friend who's from another ethnic group. How important is it for us to get to realize that there's a common humanity as well as our differences?
Sure. And I mean, unfortunately, that's probably going to be more than one conversation or the final moments that we have here. But we live in a multicultural society where something like 10% of people in this country are not white, British, and born here. And I think that that's something that is a reality. I think that if we're listening to people who are talking about forms of repatriation or discrimination, that we're going backwards, and even talking kind of language that would lead to serious distress and oftentimes mass crimes. So I think we need to be very realistic about that, and we need to talk about the way in which we can make that work for all of us, not just protecting a vulnerable minority, because remember, hate crimes and hate groups and extremists prey on the vulnerable. Whether they are Muslims or Jews or the LGBT community, that is their bread and butter. So supporting the vulnerable is important, while at the same time, where we can and where it's possible, having a dialogue with those people and saying, let's say this group of terrorists doesn't represent a whole group. They represent themselves and perhaps the other extremists that agree with them. But do they represent, in this case, millions of Muslim people in this country? Absolutely not. And there's no dearth of evidence that can show us that's exactly the case.
Okay, and as Caroline says, this is a worldwide problem that we're facing as well. We don't want to think this is just specific for ourselves. We're facing this globally. That's okay. I know you have to go, and thank you for doing that. That was really interesting and was a very good trigger for the other events we want to follow up. So if you need to go off, Matthew, please do, because I know you've got another appointment. But thank you for taking part in this.
Well, Francis, thank you very much for having me pilot this, and great success to you in this project. And I hope that we can speak again soon. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you. And thank you everyone else for joining us. And as I said, if you joined us late, this is the first of what we hope will be a series of webinars where we look at how there are problems in society, how we can address them. And so we want to look at webinars with problems, webinars with solutions, and then webinars where we bring people together, particularly professionals who are working on this, so they can learn from each other and they can learn from community groups. And then perhaps as well to develop a knowledge base, looking at some of the other webinars we've done, which actually relate to this topic, and letting people have access to those, and maybe doing some e-learning modules as well. And if we can do that, we might be able to build up a sort of good knowledge base.